Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today to the very first IQS Tech Factory Talk series. My name is Oriol Pascual, and I'm the Managing Director of IQS Tech Factory. We are a European hub for industrial innovation and entrepreneurship located in Barcelona, where we help to create the next generation of industrial companies. And how do we do that? Well, we run an acceleration program where we support hardware-based startups that develop a prototype and we help them go to a first industrial series. We also run an annual event around industrial innovation and entrepreneurship with a trade show, a conference program, and an investment forum. And finally, we manage a community of heads of innovation at large industrial companies that they are looking for innovative technologies and are looking to connect with innovative startups. So why do we do this? Why do we decide to launch this talk series, and what is the main goal? So as a hub for industrial innovation and entrepreneurship, one of our goals is to promote the idea that investing in industrial ventures it's something that it's positive for the economy and it's beneficial for everyone. And one way to do that is to have conversations with the key actors that are making it happen. So we plan for the upcoming weeks. Every other week, we are planning a series of conversations with scientists, entrepreneurs, investors, and accelerator managers in order to hear from them on how to make this happen. Before we start, I would like to thank to the IQS Tech Factory team and to the Barter team for making this event possible. So thank you very much. And also I would like to remind you that you can send your questions. There are two ways to do that. If you're watching this through our own website, on the player, there is a chat option. You can send your questions there. If you're watching through Twitter, you can send tweets with the hashtag IQS, the hashtag Talk Series IQSTF. And we're gonna grab the questions from there and at the end of the session, share them with Benjamin Joffe. Actually, this is a great way to do a segue from the introduction to introduce our guest today. So today we have with us Benjamin Joffe. Benjamin is partner at SOSV. SOSV is a 277 million fund on early stage deep tech companies. Something nice about SOSV is that as well as they're investing, they're running several acceleration programs for science-based ventures. So they have an acceleration program for hardware, they have one for bio, they have also for mobile and for food. And these are really nice combination. So the reason we invited Benjamin to join us today is because he is a key person, and he's been a key person building HACS, which happens to be the largest hardware acceleration program in the world. And he's a prominent figure in that area, and we want to hear from him. Benjamin is a mechanical engineer of education, and he's been living in Asia for a great part of his life, for more than 16 years. I mean, he can tell us something about that. And finally, Ben is also the host of the podcast From Lab to Market. Is a podcast that is being released recently. I think that it's an opportunity that has been developing out of the confinement, but actually very interesting. If you're interested in science-based venture and you're interested to hear how investors investing in these kind of ventures think and work, it's a must. So remember the podcast Lab to Market. So Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's awesome to see you again. Actually, last time we saw each other was in Barcelona. Benjamin joined us. You joined us in our event at the end of January, and so many things happened on the meantime. Huh?
Yeah, like now there's almost nobody in front of Sagrada Familia, I think, right?
No, exactly. That day we went walking around, it was packed, and now there is nobody. So, hey, we would like to have a conversation with you in general. I want to learn about you. We want to learn about HACS and how you work there, but also having a bit of the perspective on the future. How is the current situation affecting the science-based and hardware ecosystem? But my first question will be about yourself. How did a mechanical engineer end up being involved in the second most active early stage fund in the world?
Well, it's kind of a strange story, but so I graduated as mechanical engineers. That's about almost like pretty much 20 years ago now, and I did work in aerospace briefly at Airbus, and I realized that the engineering type of work wasn't really my best suit. And I was very interested in corporate strategy and innovation. So I ended up working in a consultancy, researching innovation across Asia. And I moved to Tokyo at that time. And then I kind of one thing leading to another, I kind of stayed in the region and ended up moving to Beijing and starting consultancy, researching innovation, mostly in the digital space as well. And from that got me closer to startups. I started angel investing. And then one of the founders of SOSV contacted me to help them with their hardware program that they had just started a year prior in Shenzhen. And eventually I joined, and I thought I would join to help them with one program. And now it's been over 6 years.
Hey, but you started angel investing. You were directly already investing in hardware-based startups, or you started first with the more digital?
I was more into digital things. Yeah, I didn't know much about hardware. There were very few hardware startups at the time. But what I found interesting in the hardware space is that I felt we were at a very special time in where the supply chain was finally opening up to smaller companies. It used to be kind of a closed garden of large companies, but the Shenzhen supply chain was now open for business, more and more for small startups, and like hardware startups were connecting the physical world and digital world in a way that wasn't possible before. So I think there was a really interesting shift and opportunity there. So I also saw that very often, like through my years in Asia, I saw innovation in local markets that had really hard time expanding overseas or being translated overseas. But with hardware, you get generally one key function in a device and nobody reads the manual anyway. So it's not as culturally sensitive as software, strangely. So I felt there was finally an ecosystem that was not only very important, but actually globally relevant. And that as investors, being able to bridge the Shenzhen ecosystem with any other ecosystem where the innovation would come from, and then targeting international markets, particularly the US market, would be a very great positioning.
It's funny you mentioned this connection between the digital world and the physical world, because actually something we see ourselves, we have this acceleration program, and the realization is that there is no dumb hardware anymore. Actually, every hardware company nowadays, it has a layer of connectivity, it has a layer of intelligence, it has a layer of sensors, if you want. So how do you look at these two dimensions? How do you look at the hardware dimension and the digital dimension? Sometimes hardware, it's purely an embodiment. It's a platform to deliver actually a software solution. So how do you look at these two dimensions when evaluating projects?
Yeah, so we don't invest in hardware that only has hardware. It has to have some level of software, intelligence, connectivity. And I would say connectivity is not even enough now. Like you need, you could say that today, like some form of artificial intelligence or machine learning is almost like the table stakes in hardware investments. We used to do a lot more consumer. Now we're doing a lot of B2B, enterprise, industry, and health tech solutions. So there's generally some pretty advanced stuff within the hardware. And I think for investors, having the idea that the hardware is just a way to either collect data or act on the physical world, but what you're actually selling is a service, is a much more attractive value proposition because it's more sustainable than one of sales.
why the shift? Why the shift from going from B2C to B2B? So what are the advantages of these both options?
B2C is appealing because it has a lot of visibility to start with, potentially very large markets. The problem of B2C is that people's wallets are not infinite. So anytime you sell something that's worth more than 100 euros or dollars, people hesitate. If it's more than 1,000, then people hesitate a lot. But just think about how many items you bought in the last 5 years that were worth more than 1,000 euros. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that most consumers don't really have a focus on ROI, on really very pressing needs. What consumers generally want is something that's kind of a nice to have to make their life better, and they don't really calculate ROI. Otherwise, there's a lot of types of cars that wouldn't be sold, and a lot of phones also that wouldn't be sold. So when you put those two constraints together, the lack of focus on ROI and the constraint on price, it's actually quite tough. So whereas on the B2B side, maybe the number of customers is much smaller, but the value of what you can deliver can be calculated and can be used as a sales argument. If you help a corporation save thousands or millions of dollars, the calculation for them is very easy to make, whether or not it's worth trying your thing. So that's, I think that's why some of that shift happened. Another thing is that with the cost constraint, there's just so much technology you can put in a product. If you're doing something with $100, that means $100 retail, maybe you have $25 to put in the bill of material. Well, once you eliminate a processor, battery, packaging, all that stuff, there's not a lot left. Whereas if you sell something for thousands of dollars, you can put a lot more technology in it. And so, of course, some of it can be software, but some of the software sometimes need to be processed on the device just to increase performance and to offer a better user experience. So those are important constraints, and I think that's what determined the shift for us largely.
I find it very interesting, and especially because taking into account that from your fund you invest always pre-seed and pre-product, and if we put together pre-seed, pre-product, hardware, and B2B, I believe, at least from the Spanish investor perspective, but from an investor perspective, that's very counterintuitive. So why this decision? Why are you going that path?
So yeah, it sounds like a lot of risk in one go. And our approach is that essentially there's different risks, right? You have the technology risk, whether something is possible technologically. You have the market risk. You have some part of that is kind of the timing and sales cycle risk. You have also the team risk, whether the team is solid enough and will go the distance. I think what we have with the fact that we invest via our accelerator programs, that we have quite a lot of confidence that we can help go from prototype to market. And that's something that most investors are worried about. We also have pretty good sense of the technology because we want to see a first prototype that demonstrates the key aspects of the technology. So that helps de-risk the tech. Now, the biggest risk for us is actually on the team side because, okay, maybe let me say first a word about the market. Generally, through our knowledge of different markets, through also the pitch that the companies do, they've done some market research, and ideally they have some proof of demand of what they have. Basically, that if they can achieve what they say they want to achieve, there will be customers for what they have. So that helps somewhat de-risk the existence of a market. Now, whether the speed of that market will be there is another question. For us, the biggest risk is on the team side, because if the founders don't stay the distance or don't have enough persistence or don't get along well enough, it's going to be a catastrophe. And that's much more tricky to evaluate. And I think that's more kind of a people meter. And now through the hundreds of investments and the hundreds of founders we've seen invested in, I think we have a better sense of how to do it, even though there's always a form of risk.
But is there do you have your own process to do that? So I believe after so many
Yes.
investments, you already found some characteristics. So how do you do that? Because that's always the tricky one. Eh?
So typically, applicants go through our website and post answers to some of the questions, also with a video of the prototype on the team. And then if we like what we see on the application, we do conference calls on Skype, typically, because the startups are all around the world. And within about an hour, we'll already get a sense whether there is something there for us. Very often there's a second call, and generally between that and maybe some short email back and forth, we can make decisions. And it sounds really fast and a bit crazy, but you have to keep in mind that over the past 6-7 years now that Hacks exists, we've seen thousands of startups. So we've learned a thing or two about evaluating technologies, evaluating teams, so we can go a lot faster. And also our model is that the accelerator is really our entry point for investment. We invest typically $250,000 for our Hacks program or ED-Bio program for biotech. It's a mix of cash and services. And for us, that's the kind of the first step. What we're really interested in is that the company continues and grows, and we keep investing in the seed, Series A, Series B, and at those steps, we can invest over $1 million each for each fundraise. And that's how we reinforce our position. And for us, this accelerator program also acts not only as an accelerator for the startup, but also as for us extensive due diligence. We see them in our office for typically 4 to 6 months, and we see how they behave, how they execute, how they work with others, how creative and resourceful they are. So that helps us a lot make decisions. One more thing I can mention regarding due diligence is that when we see interesting candidates, very often we also turn to our existing portfolio to get their opinion on the technology or an industry. Or in some cases, we also engage with some of the corporate partners or corporate contacts we have. So that helps also evaluate both the technology and the market opportunity.
So, well, I find it's very interesting. So why do startups come to you? So definitely one thing is funding, but then you mentioned that they are going to spend some months with you in the office. So what is special about Hacks Acceleration Program?
So most of the startups actually don't really come for the money part of our investment. I think what now is understood is that taking a prototype from a lab, taking it to a factory and taking it to market is not easy, and that there's a lot of hurdles. And what startups typically do is that they raise tons of money and they're like, okay, let's try to figure this out. And most of them have to figure this out on their own, and it costs them a lot of time, costs them a lot of money, and many of them fail. And what I think that the thing we've demonstrated through our programs is that we can help not only shorten that phase, make it more cost effective, but also empower the startups to not have somebody in the middle and try to do things remotely, a bit blind. It's almost like you're trying to cook a new dish in the kitchen, but you're actually telling the chef on the phone how he should cook this and that, and you don't see anything. You cannot test the sauce, you cannot look at the fire, you cannot have any sense of what's going on. So we empower the startups with the understanding on how to work with the supply chain. And that's really a superpower for them. And that also helps them de-risk their product development, not just for the first product, but for future products as well.
Actually, it's funny because this is exactly what we identified ourselves. We started with an acceleration program that it was more generic on science-based ventures, but then it was again and again this question of hardware-based companies coming with a functional prototype, putting it on the top of the table, saying, look, we did that, it works. Now I have to manufacture 500 of these or 2,000 of these. I have no clue how to do it. And then we look around and we realize this, at least nationally, there's no one doing that. So, okay, let's learn how to do that. And that's exactly what we are doing. And this is a difficult path with lots of risk. So what will you see, which geographic areas do you see more developed for hardware-based ventures? Which are the more mature ones and why?
Well, by sheer number of startups, US is number one, unsurprisingly. There's a lot of great institutions that develop great technologies that can be turned into products, with also people who are not afraid of turning that into companies and products. So that's the US. China is also actually has been rising very fast, and particularly in robotics and health tech. You've seen more and more interesting companies, and it's probably our second largest geography for investments. Third one, so maybe a surprise, is Canada, doing extremely well. And I think it's because they have a good number of high quality engineers and also a good support ecosystem, particularly around University of Waterloo, for example, that where we invested in a number of startups. After that, probably would be the UK. Israel is a bit of a special case because they have very strong local ecosystem. We're not particularly well connected yet in that ecosystem, so we probably miss out on many of the opportunities because they find a lot of what they need locally. And then there are some geographies that so far kind of underperform compared to what you would expect. Japan is one of them, in that sense that they have a lot of great engineers. They have a great market, obviously, but the number of startups being created is not that high. Now, if I look more at other geographies, Germany is interesting. Also, the number of startups not that high, but they tend to focus on industry, and they're quite interesting in that category. And probably that would be kind of general overview.
But it's funny because so basically Europe is pretty much not on the picture, or very little on the picture.
Well, okay, so Europe has a number of hardware startups.
I'm not saying it, but one of our interests. So we are big proponents of the idea of reindustrializing Europe. We need an economy, especially coming from Spain. We have our national economy is mainly based on services, and tourism is a key one. We are big proponents of building a stronger economy by investing more on industry. So it goes aligned, and now that you do the analysis, well, is not pretty much on the picture.
Yeah, it's because I don't see Europe as a block. I tend to look at individual countries, and when you compare the size of an economy like Japan or China or US to any single country in Europe, of course, there's a difference in scale. UK has a very special situation because English speaking, the connections to US and things like that. But I think as a whole, as an aggregate, of course, Europe has a lot of interesting startups. It's about 20-25% of our investments. US plus Canada is about 50%, and the rest is mostly Asia. So in Europe, I mean, we've done investments across many geographies. Like we have investments in Portugal, we have investment in Spain, in Sweden, Germany, Poland. So, but I don't think there's one country with a large number on its own, aside from UK, which is not I mean, geographically a European neighbor, let's say. And that's probably one of the challenges, is that kind of smaller economies don't necessarily stand out. The Nordics have an interesting number of companies compared to their size, so kind of over-delivering. But yeah, I don't really see Europe as a group, right, for this, because the ecosystems are so different. Yeah.
And what about so now we're talking mainly about deep tech. It's been in the last years, the concept, the term is deep tech, and I think everyone has its own definition. So how will you define deep tech?
Well, there's many definitions, but one would be that you need some kind of science and engineering, and maybe you need some PhD on the team. That would be kind of a good a shorthand to identify deep tech.
Okay. So in our case, we talk about industrial startups, and the way we define it is that they are science-based and they involve some sort of manufacturing process. So yes, hardware plays a key part, but then it can be also about additives. So it can be about chemistry or things like that. So we see that the whole deep tech or science-based and hardware ecosystem is growing in the last years, and especially investments in hardware, they have been going up. It's still minoritary compared to the so-called tech ventures, so the digital base and service base, but it's growing. So what would you say are the drivers for this growth? And the second question will be not just the drivers, but what are the enablers? What is it making it possible for this to happen now?
So there's drivers at different levels. So on the founders level, there's a lot of new technologies that are being made possible, and that can be now turned into companies at much lower cost. Like with the access to cloud computing, with a lot of technology bricks being available, with the ability to engage with supply chains on a much smaller scale, it's now possible to start companies and get a product to market for much less money than it used to be. And one good comparison would be to say that, in deep tech, we're probably where internet was in the 90s. So when you still needed, kind of your own servers and gradually transitioning to some kind of hosted things. And that's kind of similar situation. Now, of course, even if you have founders on startups and technologies, and the appeal of very large markets, because when you start acting on the physical world, the impact can be enormous. I mean, think about all those industries that have been underinvesting in innovation, like the Fortune 500. Many of those are not technology companies, but they need technology to evolve. They've done everything they could with software. I mean, there's still probably things they can do, but at some point, you need to touch the atoms. So there's enormous amount of opportunities. The problem is that above or below, depends on how you look at it, the founder layer, there's access to capital. And some of that goes through governments, some of that goes from private capital, like venture capital. And the challenge for those is that themselves need to be convinced it's an opportunity. Imagine you're an investor in the 90s, you're like, oh, I think this internet thing might work. That's not the majority. And those people need, in turn, to convince limited partners. So that means institutions, family offices, corporations, to give them capital to manage and invest in those startups. And that's probably the biggest barrier, is that at the top level or the bottom level, the ground level, the limited partners tend to be quite conservative. They have to focus on returns, and it's difficult to evaluate returns in areas that are still very new, which is kind of a paradox, because in a way that's kind of the original spirit of Silicon Valley, was to finance things that were very, science and engineering rooted. But I think over the past 20 years, a lot of investors have become very comfortable funding, marketplaces and SaaS and pure software.
So actually, there are so many questions that come out of what you just said. And one of the questions that I will have is, so what are you saying, or what would you say to those investors that are not used to the dynamics of hardware or science-based? So what are your arguments to convince them that there is an opportunity here?
So it's a good question, because it's really important for the growth of the ecosystem. On the one hand, I tend to think you can't convince people of anything. You can only, if they have a doubt, give them information so that they can see what's going on. Or the other option is to find more people that already believe that. And on the other hand, I think among the things that can be done is to show the early signs of science-based startups doing very well. And you can see some of that in synthetic biology, for example, in food tech. Some companies have done really, really well. And food is such an enormous market that it's pretty obvious. In other sectors, like smart devices, health technologies, some sectors have had some early results. But if you wait for results to enter the category, almost by definition, you're going to be late. So
you're late, yeah.
I think the best we can do is provide information about the opportunity and explain why it makes sense. And so I'm trying to do that through the podcast you mentioned earlier. Some people, we also published a report about deep tech trends that gives a lot of examples of what's going on, so people can learn. And there's a few other, sources here and there, but I think they're just not very visible, and it requires more effort. And fundamentally, if you want to understand the technology you're investing in, that's going to require more effort than to just look at the usual KPIs of a SaaS company.
Well, but because that's a bit the thing. So what we see here is that, at least in our ecosystem, the dynamics of the digital ventures, so the ones based on services and using digital channels, those are well known, and these people playing that game. The dynamics of the biotech sector are also well known, and people, well, there's people playing that game. But when you but there is a playbook, exactly. But there is not, at least from my perspective, there is not such a playbook for hardware-based ventures or science-based that is not biotech. And that's always a tricky part. I mean, one of the challenges we find ourselves is that we have this incredible portfolio of companies which they've been doing very well from the initial idea to the first, to validate the technology, to the first functional prototype. And they found ways to find these phases. But when it's time to industrialize, there's literally nobody there. I mean, yes, you are there. And it happens actually that our ventures, maybe they're a bit too mature for your fund. But there's literally no one there. And you just say it, that's because there is not a playbook. So that's maybe the key that we are missing here.
I think really some of the keys is about highlighting the size of the opportunities. And also maybe people are just going to some investors are going to get tired of, swimming in a red ocean, competing with all other kind of vanilla investors doing the same type of things, looking at the same type of KPIs. And unless you have superior deal flow and get access to, the startups with all the right numbers on the growth and everything and the great teams, you only got to get second, third tier opportunities. Whereas here is a sector where you have lots of large markets to address and very little competition. Like we're discussing earlier with another investor, talking about how the valuations have evolved. And as it turns out, in deep tech space, with the pandemic and things, I don't think the valuations have changed that much because they were, quite reasonable in the first place.
We are going to get into that, but actually, I was wondering, what would you say is the role of corporates on that specific aspect we're talking about? Because what we see, at least our experience, is that it is the private sector, are the corporations, those that you mentioned, that they need to look for innovation, the ones funding, maybe not in a structured way, maybe not in a very orthodox way, but they are the ones funding those spaces. So what is your experience from the dimension of the fund that you run? What is the role of the corporate and yeah?
I think a lot of corporations these days have quite low R&D budgets. Even the big tech companies that spend more than 10% of their annual budget on R&D, they still rely a lot on acquisitions to get new services and products. So if the big tech companies that spend the most on R&D are also spending the most on acquisitions, if you're in a sector where you don't spend too much on R&D, well, how are you going to move forward? And how are you not going to be overtaken by competitors that innovate more? So I think a lot of corporations have realized that, and they try to practice, open innovation. But eventually, I think it has also to connect with a innovation acquisition strategy with more mergers and acquisitions. And the challenge is, let's say you're a food company, I don't know, Kellogg's, or you are a consumer company like Procter & Gamble. You used to buy products or new brands in your category, but you're not necessarily used to buy technology companies that might have very different type of offering, very different type of culture. So I think each of those corporations need to build a specific playbook on how to buy technology, on how to work with, and how to buy technology companies. And that's tricky because many acquisitions turn out not great because of a mismatch in culture, mismatch in expectations, and that's something that corporations need to ramp up knowledge on very quickly. And one way to do that is to become investors in venture funds that gives them access to deal flow, give them access to an array of technologies, and then gradually they can identify through that, either build their own practice or simply focus on the acquisition part, on the integration part.
There is a lot of work to be done then. And I think the triangle, the connection between corporate and a startup, this is the one that benefits both sides and is definitely an enabler for the kind of ventures we are working with. Hey, but you brought up the issue of the pandemic. And I think we are living a moment in which there is lots of uncertainty. We are all trying to figure out the current impacts and what's going to happen mid and long term. Can you give us some highlight about, did you check how is the pandemic affecting your portfolio? What is the size of the impact?
Yeah, so many of our companies have had a drop in sales. Some of them had to delay fundraising because conditions are difficult. Most investors are focused on supporting their existing portfolio rather than making new investments at the moment. But we also saw some of our companies actually grow during the pandemic because they had an offering that was really compatible with the situation. Of course, some of those in healthcare or biotech that were directly relevant had a lot of momentum. But we also see that companies doing industrial or enterprise solutions that would reduce human contact by using robots or other type of things, also getting a lot of attention. What's the main problem is that the business development is slowed down by the fact that it's more difficult to have face-to-face meetings, more difficult to do installations on pilots. So that's what slowed down.
Okay, but yeah, so there are some sectors that are benefiting from that. Do you see examples of some of your ventures that they develop new opportunities because of the pandemic? They decided to do a spin-off, or they decided to reassign the technology to new applications?
We have some. I have a few examples. So some was just a small move. For example, we had a company that was called AvidBots, based in Canada. They're doing commercial floor cleaning robots. Those are
sorry, Ben. Isn't this one of your poster childs?
A little bit, yes. Because
yeah, okay.
I mean, it's one of our more.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's one of our more mature companies. Yeah, they have over 100 people now, and which is quite large for a robotics company. They sell their robots for airports and hospitals and schools all over the world. And basically, they just added some disinfectant to their cleaning solution. They say, okay, now we can clean your floor from the virus. So for them, it was very easy change. But we have more interesting type of pivots. Another robotics company that was doing logistics robots had some kind of a platform robot where you could put things on the generally for indoor logistics. Some of the clients reached out to them to ask if they could do something around disinfection. So they looked into it, and they just repurposed their robotic platform to put Philips high-power UV lights on it. And they also added infrared cameras. So now they're selling robots. So it took them about just 2 weeks to repurpose the robot. They're very fast, a Chinese company. And they repurposed that robot. And a few weeks later, they were shipping already dozens of them. And so the robot, when there's nobody around, could disinfect a space using UV light. And when there's people around, they could do infrared scanning to check people's temperature.
You mentioned something, we saw some examples in our portfolio also, but you mentioned something that I think it's key, which is speed. And,
yes.
and probably when we are talking about the greatness of, you are located in Shenzhen, and typically people believe that being in China, if you're a hardware startup, it's about price, but it's really about speed. So things can happen very, very
That's
fast.
True. Yeah.
One obsession we have ourselves is that how can we bring some of that speed to the local market? So what are the needs? And examples we saw in Spain is that Well, the classic example, we didn't have enough ventilators during the pandemic.
Mm.
And we saw examples of designing, building, certifying, and distributing ventilators within 3 weeks' time. And
Wow.
this is not just a hack. So it's a product that got the National Agency of the Medical Device certified. So it made me think that speed is possible even in our markets. It's just a question of reorganizing. So it's not an infrastructure problem. It's a question of how you put the pieces together. So just wanted to pick up on the idea that you mentioned of your company also, like reorganizing in just 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, the speed is really the key. And one advantage of the Shenzhen ecosystem is just how large and deep the supply chain is, from any component to any type of material, from anything in plastic, in wood, metal, whatever you want. And the fact that also I think a lot of factories and suppliers think a little bit like investors, because they know that initially when they work with startups, it's not big volume, it's not big business. So they really try to figure out who could become a larger client later. And by working with several startups, they're like, okay, well, maybe some of them will stay small, but some of them might grow. And then I'll be the one they're working with larger volumes. So I think this is also key to have the mind, like if your suppliers are not interested in what you're doing and don't take some level of risk, you always, as a small volume startup, just beginning and barely knowing what you're doing, you're always going to be at the bottom of the queue.
Before going to some questions from the audience, because we are receiving some, I would like to ask you about the global value chain. So I think one of the lessons we are learning from Europe, at least, is that it's becoming even more strategic to keep our manufacturing infrastructure locally. Can you foresee some shift from, we had this wave of globalization and delocation or relocation of manufacturing for the last 20 years. Do you foresee some return of that, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, I think many governments now have realized that relying on foreign supply chains is, particularly in times of crisis, a big constraint. Not exactly sure what was the situation in Spain, but here, I mean, the government has been very criticized for not being able to procure masks, ventilators, and tests, and all sorts of things. So I think some of it has to do with, having a national strategic stock or capacity to produce things. Like in France, there's only 4 factories able to produce masks in the entire country. Whereas in Shenzhen, I'm pretty sure some factories that had nothing to do with masks started almost overnight making masks, because they can switch their business on the dime. They used to repurpose their factory line. They're just much more nimble and agile. So I think it will help probably repatriate some of that. But the challenge is that, it's not just about having 1, 2, 3 factories doing this or that. It's really a large system. And the Shenzhen supply chain is the result of literally decades of multi-billion-dollar investments. Anytime you buy a laptop, you buy a phone, you're actually investing in the Shenzhen supply chain. Anytime you buy a toy, that used to be also like a Shenzhen specialty. So, that kind of adds up, and it's not so easy to replicate.
That's an interesting one. So the barrier is quite high.
I think what might happen that would be more interesting to me is not to try to bring back some of the old stuff, but bring back new stuff. So one of the new things is having factories with more automation and more advanced robots, so that could do much more different things and could don't require maybe as much programming, because you can just like change the change their tasks much more flexibly. So that could be one opportunity. So it won't necessarily bring back a lot of jobs, but it brings back manufacturing capacity, which enable other types of job creation, but just not factory jobs. And so that's one possibility. The other thing that's interesting is things around micro manufacturing. So instead of bringing factories, kind of old style, like big space, a bunch of machines in it, you could have very small machines that have some of the key features of larger machines, but at a much smaller scale, lower price, and lower volume. And in our portfolio, we actually invested in a number of companies doing things like that. So we have one company doing a water jet cutter. And if you want to use water jet in industrial setting, it's big, it's messy, it's expensive, but there's a lot of things that you could use it for at smaller scale. So this company called Wazer, based in New York, that's what they do, and they have a machine that's less than $10,000. Same for, just to give an example of another kind of micro manufacturing company, it's a company called Unspun, and they make a machine that so they use combination of 3D body scanning and a 3D weaving machine to create custom-sized jeans. So you can have a pair of pants based on your exact measurements. And so that's really convenient for anybody who doesn't fit into the exact dimension of, small, medium, large, and whatever sizes exist. And it could actually make even the sizing of clothing irrelevant, because you would move to a new paradigm, which is your size, which is what people want, right? So that's,
I have to say, I experienced that. It used to be a company that they shut down. Actually, it was of Chinese origin. I believe it's Soho, or Zozo.
Zozo. Those Japanese.
Yeah, it's Japanese, exactly. And it's a pity they shut down, because I got some clothes from there and I love it. I mean, of course, you had to go to kind of
Did you have the polka dot suit?
Yes, exactly. you receive at home this lycra kind of thing with lots of dots, and then you put your phone there, you scan. But then it worked perfectly. I got shirts and T-shirts and jeans, and there was no size. They were my size, and they worked perfectly.
So yeah,
but unfortunately they closed down.
Yeah, they changed. Actually, they didn't close. They changed the service, but I think the company is still doing quite well. And it's a Japanese company, but you could say this is kind of first more cumbersome type of customization. The 3D scanning thing would be that you go into a cabin and there's a 3D scanner that scans you in your underwear. And then once they have that, there's processing, and then they get your dimensions, and then you can order online, and then you can have different cuts. Like if you want like more baggy style, but for your size, you can have that. If you want more tight, you can have that. But they're exactly on the dimensions. And I think that's really exciting, because the machine they use is actually quite small. It could fit in a small apartment, and you could have that in almost every city where they have enough customers or distribution centers. So that's that totally changes the supply chain of the garment industry, because there's no reason to ship from products from around the world, from like across the world. There's no reason to stock. There's no inventory. It's all on demand. So, and there's much less waste. So it's really interesting to think that there could be some industrial changes using this type kind of next generation micro manufacturing machines.
This is a big change. Hey, before we end the next 10 minutes, I would like, so we got a few questions from the audience, and maybe let's see if we can go for a couple of them or three of them. So we changed subject completely, but one of our viewers is asking from the perspective of a startup, actually, and is asking, should you sell the vision or should you sell the technology behind your project? So if someone is coming to
both.
you, yeah.
Of course, both. Well, it kind of depends a bit on the context of the first contact. Sometimes, I mean, the technology is a means to an end. The technology is there to achieve something that's ideally big. That's what attracts investors. But then you can start with the vision, because I think that's the easiest to understand. And then you can explain some of the how, like how you can do that with your technology, and how different it is, and how difficult it is, and how defensible it is. So that's what I would do.
Actually, it's funny. We will open a complete other debate here, but according to the definition of deep tech, that it's science-based and there is some sort of PhD on the team, these companies, they tend to be more technology push rather than market pull. So it tends to work the other way around. It's about finding the right market application for that technology.
So that's something they have to do. And some investors are more tuned to helping you through that, finding opportunities for technology. But I would say the majority of investors, they want to hear about the vision and the bigger market opportunity.
We have quite few questions about the future of biotech. So one program you're running is Indie Bio, and there is a program on biotech and medical devices. You just opened, in fact, a branch in New York right before the whole lockdown started. So I don't know how is this working.
It was all part of a plan.
But maybe summarizing a little bit the questions, because there are many questions about how do you see the evolution of biotech. It seems to be a winner. So, and it also some questions around, we see a lot of new investments in biotech and investors are all bullish about biotech. What's your take on that? But also I was wondering, you made a big bet on this area. So give us a bit the picture.
So I think it's important to distinguish a bit things within biotech. So our specialty is synthetic biology with Indie Bio, and health tech devices within hacks. But I'll focus maybe more on the synthetic biology. So I think it's pretty clear that everybody got a wake-up call that with the coronavirus, we all have bodies, there's a physical world around us, and that we need to deal with it, and it's actually important. So it brought a lot of attention to biotech sector. And I think overall it's a tailwind. We don't really do like the general pharma things with like molecules on the long years of research and type of things. That's not for us. It's more like pharma companies. But what we see is that our synthetic biology companies, whether they're doing diagnostics or lab-grown food, we have invested in companies like Memphis Meats, that's doing a meat in the lab, Perfect Day, that's doing milk protein, Clara Foods. Those companies are doing fantastic. And I think people also realize that when supply chains are disturbed, it's not just for manufacturing, it's also for food. And that there's the problem of food supply and food safety that are very major. So we were very early investors in cellular agriculture through Memphis Meats about 5 years ago. And we've done a number of investments in the field, ranging from meat to fish. We've done mushroom cultures to create lab-grown leather. And now we're looking at, interestingly, lab-grown vegetarian protein or lab-grown plant, actually not necessarily for food, but plant protein. So that's one of the sectors, but we're also open to a lot of computational bio therapeutics. And now to answer your question about what's going on in New York. So New York, the program is just literally just opened this month. It's been backed by the state of New York, actually, who's throwing $25 million over 5 years to have us invest in about 100 companies, because they see there's a lot of talent, but not a lot of support for early stage biotech companies. And those companies can come from all around the world. Like we invest in European companies going there as well. We had to go full remote until things can change. The transition has been a bit, intense, but as it turns out, for some companies, actually more convenient because they don't need to relocate and they can get the advice and the support they need. Sometimes they have access to facilities already where they are, so they don't necessarily need our lab in New York. But obviously, there are also some part that are missing, part of the interactions between the companies, which is very important because you can get a lot of advice from other founders and other startups. That's one of the key values of us having physical spaces. Also from our team, it's easier, to just turn your chair, just walk a few steps rather than set up a call. But overall, very bullish on biotech. I think biotech is getting in the spotlight right now, and it's great because we're ready for that.
That's awesome. Maybe before, I would like to end up with one question before we finish, and this is going back to the idea of the team and the importance of the team. So someone is asking, with the team being so crucial, how can founders improve their odds when building the initial team? How to identify or how to choose best suppliers for a new technology, and when to start looking into this?
So the team part, that's a tricky one, because people generally team up with people they know, and they don't necessarily have a lot of choice depending on where they are. There's an interesting program you might be familiar with called Entrepreneur First, who's basically putting together about 50 plus people who want to start companies and have, you know, a deep tech background. And they mix them up, and they pay them for a few months, and they help them to try different teams. So it's kind of a lean startup applied to teams. And it was actually the interview of our first podcast with the co-founder of Entrepreneur First. So that's probably one model. Now, if you have an existing team, what might be interesting is to see whether you're covering everything from the technology standpoint, generally what you have, but also the business capabilities and also the organizational and communication capabilities. If nobody in the team is a strong communicator or is organized, the risk you have with such a team is that you have crazy research, chaotic research, and you never converge into a product, and you're never able to sell a product. If you add organization, maybe you will get to a product, but if you don't have communication and business skills, then you might never get the attention and open the channels to sell it. So at SOSV, for every team we invest in, we get them to do an evaluation based on their a test of their preferences. It's called the HBDI Herman profile, and they go through that, and that helps the team understand their strong spots and their weak spots. The strong parts are generally that they have a vision, they have technical skills, they're very analytical, and the weak spots almost everywhere across all our programs is that they're not very organized, and they're not very good at communicating and at selling. So at least identifying that, they can decide to either apply themselves to learn those skills or try to find the right additional co-founder or hires to help them go through that. So I think that's what helps.
You will go for them learning the skills, so it's not hacks providing them support on those areas.
Well, there's just so much we can do. Like over time, so through our program, they can learn some of that, but eventually some of them has to do that. It's probably a full-time job at some point. So either they like it and they learn to do it, and they want to learn it, or they don't. And in that case, it's better they stick to what they're good at and where they add the most value for the company, and find additional talent that would plug that gap.
No, that's clear. So, hey, thank you very much, Ben. I think this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm so happy to reconnect with you. And I hope that we can see each other again in person very soon. Either we're planning to do that in Hello Tomorrow in Paris, but it was canceled. So hopefully at the end of the year,
maybe
postpone. Or
I just
otherwise,
had a call with them today, actually.
Exactly, or otherwise at the beginning of next year in our own event in Barcelona. So thank you very much for your time, and with that, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank the IQS Tech Factory and Barter teams for making this event possible. I also like to remind you all that we are going to be back in 2 weeks' time. That will be Tuesday 19th at 1 p.m. Central European Standard Time, and we're going to do it with Simone van Nerven. Simone is an innovation catalyst at Chanel, so a consumer brand, and she is the former head of innovation at companies like KLM and Welling. So we look forward to have a conversation with her from the corporation perspective. So thank you very much. Look forward to see you in a couple of weeks' time.